Hello and welcome to the QA Therapy podcast. Are you looking to improve your overall testing and quality practices? My name is Sergio Freire and I'm a solution architect and a testing advocate at Xray.
And my name is Cristiano Cunha, and I'm also a solution architect and test advocate. And we'll be your hosts and QA therapists throughout this series. In this podcast, we're going to tackle some of the most common testing and quality challenges that we all face in our teams. So if this sounds good to you, keep on listening. Nowadays, with the evolution of services towards microservices and the need to support mobile, we see more and more companies investing in application programming interfaces, aka APIs. This also means that testing must be able to cover these new services. Do you know how to approach API validations? Sometimes, even when we are not producing APIs, we are consuming from external ones. In that case, what should we have in mind? To assist us on this topic, we have a special guest with us, Diogo Rede. But before welcoming him, let's see what really bring you here to this episode. What are the symptoms that you may have been feeling that have brought you to listen to this podcast? So ask yourself, are you struggling in your tests due to a lot of dependencies? Or is the main culprit for test failures external APIs that aren't as stable as you wish for? Or does your team struggle to validate multiple versions of the API?
All these are symptoms that we are not probably addressing API testing in the best way. We need to take a step back and understand what changes we need to introduce to cover APIs in our testing process. Otherwise, you may end up finding bugs in production. Let's dive a bit into this topic. And today, as Cristiano mentioned, we have here with us Diogo Rede, our expert QA therapist, to assist on diagnosis and prescription on these symptoms related to API testing. Diogo is also a solution architect and testing advocate as us, and has a deep experience in testing and especially in the test automation area. He is a frequent speaker in conferences and meetups and loves to be an active part of the testing community. Welcome, Diogo. Are you feeling comfortable on our QA therapy couch?
Well, it's sadly as comfortable as my own chair, but I get what you mean. Just kidding. Of course, I'm comfortable, and thanks for having me here.
Okay, great. So let's start our conversation, and let's start by the basics. What are APIs and API tests all about? In brief words, if for our listeners.
Well, you may have heard of people talking about APIs in different contexts. So, for instance, if you're writing an application, you may call an API the methods that the class exposes. But here we are going to talk about HTTP APIs, right? So, what are these APIs? These are APIs that expose your system through the HTTP protocol, and you can interact with them through a bunch of HTTP methods. You can use the different HTTP verbs like get, post, put, etc. Send payloads, receive data back. So it's basically the entry point for a lot of applications. And about API tests, well, API tests are tests that stimulate the API directly through this same protocol, the HTTP protocol. And there's a bunch of different tests you can do using the APIs, like functional tests, performance tests, security tests, and so on.
We have seen a lot of companies moving towards APIs. And in your experience here, why do you think they are making this move? What is driving this?
Well, I see two different subjects we might talk about in this question. So one of them is public APIs. Public APIs nowadays is the foundation of a lot of businesses. And in my opinion, it's a great way of making your business a platform, making it available to other people, allowing other people to even build more things on top of it. Like, for instance, we have the example of ChatGPT nowadays, who has its public API. and it allows people to build a whole lot of apps on top of that. And I totally love public APIs. I like to interact with APIs and test them, so that's a cool thing to have. A different subject would be APIs from an internal architecture perspective, from a microservices perspective. And that's what a lot of people try to achieve nowadays. And it does have some advantages. It helps you have a loosely coupled system, which allows a lot of control over things like deployment, testing, etc. And for instance, even the Dora project refers that loosely coupled systems are one of the key factors for DevOps success, and that's very important. But at the same time, it's hard to manage when it starts to scale. So it can also be a big challenge for companies managing a lot of small moving pieces, because in one hand it allows you to have better architecture because you won't create so many dependencies, or at least you shouldn't. But at the same time, it may start everything getting tangled up. So you must be very thoughtful, in my opinion, about the size of your services, how many services you have, and how they all come together. And you have to have a lot of control over that, or you can easily go into chaos.
So from, let's say, a more process perspective, in which part of the process should we consider API tests? Is something that we should consider like doing more upfront? What is your perspective on that?
Well, I think anytime you have an API ready would be a good moment to start testing that API.
Exactly.
Because a lot of people wait until the full system is ready. And a lot of people even say they test their APIs through their UI, that they don't even test the API directly, which can be very troublesome. I've seen it happen in the past in some of my experiences. And what happens is that it's a little late in the cycle, and you will probably not test everything the API has to offer. You will only test what the UI will allow you to test, and that will lead to a lot of testing gaps in the API. And later on in time, when you actually want to use those other API features that weren't exposed by that UI, you will try to use them, and you'll be like, oh, okay, so this has been tested, the system is good, it's working. But when you start hitting those endpoints that you didn't test when you should have tested, well, you will see that you will find a lot of problems there. So yeah, as soon as you have the API, do start testing, because these are tests that are easy to implement, they are fast to execute, and you can have a lot of quick wins by implementing this.
Yeah, it's really helpful to try to address that as early as possible. But now we have also fast deliveries, we have pipelines, and with all of this that you have described about microservices and probably dependencies between microservices, how can teams define what to put or when to put those tests into a pipeline? Are they calling each other pipelines to validate that the dependencies are being tested? What's your experience on that and your view?
Okay, so yeah, dependencies. That's one of the big problems we need to talk about when talking about API testing. Well, not just API testing, like all kinds of testing, but we are here to talk about API testing. So yeah, when you have a pipeline and you want to have your tests in that pipeline, you shouldn't have to depend on anyone else, on any other pipeline, any other systems. I mean, I'm all for end-to-end tests, and I think that's something that needs to be done. But if you want to shift left and test earlier, you need to come up with strategies to do that. So in a pipeline, I think it comes down to having mechanisms to not depend on other services, like having mocks for those services, or having sandbox environments. Also, one of the things that I found in the past is that sometimes people don't even know about the dependencies of their own services. So if you have that sort of methodology where each team is responsible for some services, but then you don't know that you need something from another service, and someone messes that up on that other service will mess it up on your service as well. So one of the things in pipelines as well is that you can declare the dependencies of the service. The service can have sort of a health check where he will check if the other services are available when they are deployed as well. You can also have sort of a central discovery service to to know what service depends on what are the dependencies between services, so that when you deploy you can see that everything is working correctly. It works like sort of a health check. So I've been talking about two different things here. One is testing in the pipeline without any dependencies, but you also need to guarantee that you know the dependencies, and that when you actually deploy, that those dependencies are met and your service is working just fine. So yeah, it's hard, but you can come up with a couple of strategies.
Diogo, and I think you touched a bit this moments ago, but sometimes we hear teams saying that they test APIs whenever they are doing the end-to-end tests. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, like I mentioned, I think it's a very reducing way of testing an API. I mean, there's no denying that they are actually exercising the API, and they are, well, indirectly testing it when they do end-to-end tests. But to actually take full advantage of API testing and doing proper API testing is actually hitting the API directly and having access to everything that anyone would have access to. Because, for instance, you might uncover security issues. You might find out that the app isn't secured in some endpoints. You can play around with things like different headers, different payloads that you don't have control over when you are simply using a UI that does everything for you. And while I understand that the UI part of tests is important, because that's what if you don't test the UI, you don't know that it will work with that API. And like testing whole flows, complex flows, it's important to do that through a UI. But before that, you must guarantee that the API is working properly, it's secure, it's performant. So there's a lot you can and you should do before actually testing things end to end. Or else, like I mentioned, you will have lack of test coverage. You might find out things a lot later that you shouldn't find out. So yeah, playing around directly with the API is ideal here.
And glad you mentioned that, playing with the API, because many people think that API tests are technical and can only be automated. So I remember that you were doing some hands-on kind of exercise some weeks ago with an API using tools and your thoughts. So are API tests only tackable or addressable by test automation, or can we use, or should we use also our exploratory testing skills to uncover problems in these APIs?
No, that's a great question. I think, well, exploratory testing is not done just on the UI level. On the API level, you can also do exploratory testing. And I encourage everyone to actually play around with their APIs, try a couple of different things, different flows, etc., to see if everything fits together. And yeah, I was giving that presentation a couple of weeks ago, I think. And yeah, I talk about a couple of tools because I think, well, a lot of people see APIs, like you mentioned, as a technical thing, a thing that it's hard to get into, etc. And I agree that not everyone can proficiently test an API and understand all of the details of an API and the HTTP protocol. But I think it's easier to get started than what people think. I mean, back in the day in my career when I wasn't a technical tester, let's call it that, I didn't know anything about APIs until someone came up to me and told me, hey, there's this story that you need to test that is only testable through the API. And I was like, oh, what the hell is this? And the guy just showed me, I think it was SoapUI back then, and said, hey, you do this and you have these methods, etc., and this is supposed to work like this. And I just started playing around with it. I mean, there it had a UI. It was intuitive enough for me, so I just did it. I didn't really need to have a lot of technical skills, although I encourage everyone to actually study about APIs, about the HTTP protocol, but you don't need to have coding skills to begin with. You don't need to automate using code. You just need a basic understanding of how the HTTP protocol works, like what are verbs, what are headers, what are payloads, like the basic components of a request, and what a response is. So you just know that, yeah, you send a request and you get a response with what you requested for, or at least you hope to. And nowadays there are a lot of modern tools. For instance, even when people develop code, they usually have extensions to generate Swagger UIs, so you can just test through the Swagger UI, which is very intuitive, but sort of limits the interactions you can have with the API. So you can move to tools like I mentioned, SoapUI or Postman. Postman is probably the most famous nowadays. And you should be able to just start playing around, creating requests, validating the responses, etc. And Postman even allows you to have tests on top of the requests you do to validate that you're getting a certain property or a certain value. So definitely, I think everyone can easily take the leap to API testing, even if they are just regular UI testers.
Yeah, tools are helping a lot here and making it more intuitive for persons that doesn't have that technical knowledge. Totally agree with you. And playing around with them will grasp you a lot of how things are working and what should you focus on. But from my experience, you see that there are a lot of APIs that do a lot of things, but they are not like standardized, or they are not the same approach. Do you think that there is some kind of standards regarding APIs? We heard something about Open API that is like the way to go. Do you think that it's the right approach? What is Open API in really brief words, and how can it help here?
Okay, so yeah, actually my last talk was about Open API. Because I particularly like Open API specifications. They are a standard right now that allows you to describe APIs in a way that it's both understandable by humans and by computers. So you can write it yourself. It's usually a YAML file that you write. It has a structure. You need to understand the structure, etc. And then it also allows you to do a lot of things with other tools. So it also serves as a communication layer for stuff like between, let's say, product, dev, QA, etc. Everyone is on the same page. They have that document and they can use it to guide their activities. And then you can have tools help you out to, for instance, auto-generate code, auto-generate documentation, do contract validation. I also like them to do that in my API testing. I just use the Open API specifications as contract validation artifacts, among a lot of other stuff. And yet it also gives you a lot of freedom, because it doesn't tell you, hey, you have to do, your API needs to follow this and this and this and that. No, you just describe the API components. There are other standards that are more strict, like the RESTful standard that has a lot more rules than Open API specifications. But Open API specifications are I think they are great to describe APIs, and then there's a lot you can do with that, both from an automation perspective and even human perspective, process perspective of software development.
Do you think that the community is adhering to that much, or what's your feeling on Open API?
Yeah, I actually think so. I mean, I see a lot of platforms nowadays that, for instance, for API documentation, which nowadays is very important. Like we mentioned, there's a lot of public APIs and you need to be able to use those APIs. And there's a lot of tools that allow you to generate pretty documentation from those APIs. There are tools that allow you to automatically generate servers based on those APIs, or even clients as well. So there really is a lot of people trying to leverage these open API specs to do a lot of things. When it comes to me, right now I'm using them for documentation. So, for instance, we on my company we are currently using open API specs to describe our API and then generate documentation on top of that, validate changes, because you can also have compare different versions of the Open API spec and see what changed to manage changes. And also for testing, I love simply being able to use a method that simply checks my responses against that contract. And if anything goes wrong, it will tell me exactly what is wrong in that request, and I can report those problems.
Diogo, we hear a lot about mocking the services and how important that is for testing. So can you tell us a bit more about the advantages on implementing mocks, and what are the mocks all
Yes,
about?
sure. So mocks can be a solution for some of the challenges we spoke about. Um, and it works. What mocks are is replacing the services with sort of a fake server or fake responses that you get, and you can manipulate these responses to retrieve the data you want. And this solves two problems. It solves problem service dependency and also the test data management, because you can simply manage the data you want to get from those other services, which in this case will be mocks, and even third-party services. So if you have a third-party service that doesn't have a sandbox, I usually prefer when they have a sandbox, because it will be a little more true to its own business. But you can still replace it with a mock server, and you can develop even if you can't talk to that third party in any stage of your development. So yeah, mocks can be a solution, but I think they are also a challenge. I mean, I've had challenges with those in the past, because well, first off, there's maintenance of the mocks, because you create a lot of text data that you need to maintain as things evolve and change. So that's one big problem. And then there's also when you have a stateful flow, a complex flow you want to mock, sometimes it's hard to create the right expectations when you do each request and you expect something to come the next request something different. Sometimes it's hard to set it up. And also to manage change, because you don't always know when other services change. So if you keep testing against your mocks and the service changes, you will have false negatives, because you will think, okay, everything is good, but then when you actually integrate with that other service, things won't work as you expect. So I think there needs to be a balance between mocks and also end-to-end tests or integrated tests with other services.
Yeah, and what you talked about, versioning is also one of the problems, because you start to have, well, we don't know which version you want to test with. And with public API, it's a really big problem, because when you have clients that are focusing on your API, your public API, and you do releases and change the version, you better not try to have breaking changes, or they will not be happy. But sometimes it happens. But more than that, how is this versioning in APIs is impacting testing on your perspective? How can we deal with that? What version should we test for? Should we test all of the version available? Should we focus on one? It's a really problem that I see appearing with API.
Yeah, that's also true. Well, my first recommendation is that you actually set a deprecation date on older versions, so you don't have to manage all that. But in case you can't do that, and while they are both living at the same time, well, I think if you have a good test, good automated test coverage, it won't be too much of a problem. But if you don't and you need to test and you want to test everything, well, I think you should always focus on the newest releases, the newest version, because that's the one that will probably undergo more development and will be subject to more changes. Because usually when you launch a new version, you won't likely be making changes to the other one unless there's like a high priority bug, something like that. But if you have a good automation set, you can probably even reuse the automation components from one version to the other. The big problem, like you mentioned, is breaking changes. Sometimes it's hard to control, and I've seen more than once APIs that they have a minor change, but then it ends up being a breaking change because maybe they remove a property, they do something like that, and they don't want to actually release a major version. So that can be problematic. So I think, well, contract testing definitely helps here because that's what usually breaks between the APIs and the clients. And other than that, my biggest advice is to also try to maintain a nice automation test suite, so you don't have to worry too much about testing it yourself. And well, hopefully no one will complain about compatibility problems.
Diogo, and our time flies by. So my last question is around certain risks that arise with APIs, namely security and performance. And why do you think they may be so important for APIs, and what does this mean for testing?
Okay, so like we mentioned, the API is the entry point to your backend, and in the backend is where you have all your data, all your business logic, everything. Well, some people may expose that too much in the UI as well, but hopefully not. Nowadays, I think people are moving towards having the UI more and more as just a data display part of the application. So yeah, everything comes down to the API. And nowadays, security testing is very important with all these public APIs that may have breaches that may allow attackers to get your personal data, to get a lot of different data that will sometimes even like data that doesn't sound very important. Like, I don't know, let's say your name and a couple of personal details about you. It may not seem important, but that allows a lot of scammers to then go do phishing attacks, etc. So companies definitely need to improve their security testing of APIs, and they can do that, for instance, with the tools that do some checks. There are tools that even measure the security of your API just by looking at an open API spec. They can come up with some ideas on how you can improve security. Others do like injection attacks and all kinds of attacks. But I'm also all for, although I have done some security testing in minor situations, I'm all up for having an actual security department that thoroughly tests the APIs from a security perspective, because it's a very challenging thing, and it's very, very specialized. So I would like to know that someone who actually specializes in security is testing the APIs that expose my own data. And also performance. We were talking about performance. Well, that's also very important because performance is usually about processing and about network traffic. So the more optimized your API is, the better experience your clients will have, and the less problems you'll have with things like performance of your systems, etc. And I've done a little bit of performance testing as well. I also have usually worked in companies that have a team of performance testers that do end-to-end, sort of end-to-end performance in production environments, etc. But I've also implemented performance testing inside the pipeline, for instance. And I did this. It's not like you get the actual performance you're going to have at the end of the day, but you can benchmark against the previous version. So a lot of times what would happen is that the same tests running in one version and the other would start increasing their times by, let's say, seconds, but seconds in few tests, it's a lot. So if that scales up, it will scale up to minutes and maybe hours. And we found out some issues like that. So that's one tip I can give people about performance testing.
So thanks Diogo for being here with us today and talk about APIs and API testing. It was really a really interesting episode.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before ending our episode, it's time for some vitamins. We know that in general, they're good for our health. In this case, we'll be talking about vitamin X, where X stands for Xray. Xray can help you manage and streamline your API testing efforts, ensuring that your application APIs are thoroughly tested, secure, and meet the intended requirements. With Xray, you can create and manage test cases for API, including defining test steps and expected outcomes. Xray supports a range of test types, allowing you to cover all aspects of API testing. Additionally, you can easily integrate with tools such as Postman, Karate, and others. Xray makes it easy to import existing test results and provides detailed test execution reports, helping you quickly identify and diagnose any issues in the APIs.
And we have reached the end of the episode. In this episode, we have seen that APIs are the backbone of modern software applications, allowing different components to communicate with each other seamlessly. Testing APIs helps us to identify and resolve any issues in the communications between different components, such as incorrect data formats or protocol mismatches. By thoroughly testing the API, teams can ensure that the application functions as intended and meets the user's expectations. Furthermore, API testing helps to improve the overall quality and reliability of the software. API tests can identify bugs and errors in the code early in the development process, allowing developers to fix them before they become bigger problems. This approach can significantly reduce the costs and time required for bug fixing, as it is easier and less expensive to fix issues in the early stages of development.
So see you in our next therapy session. Happy testing!
Happy testing!